The horse told him first. Boone was a 12-year-old bay gelding who didn't spook at coyotes or thunder or gunfire. But that morning when Wade Hensley led him out of the cabin toward the barn, the animal planted his hooves in the dirt and wouldn't move. He turned his head toward the barn, and his nostrils flared and his ears pinned flat, and he made a sound low in his chest that Wade had never heard him make before. Not fear. Warning. Something is in there that wasn't there yesterday. Wade set the feed bucket down and looked at the barn. The doors were closed the way he'd left them the night before. The latch was still set. Nothing looked wrong from the outside. But Boone knew, and Wade had learned a long time ago, that a horse that's been alive 12 years on open range knows things a man doesn't. So he went back inside and took the rifle from the wall and walked to the barn with it held low at his side. Not aimed, not cocked, just present, the way you carry a tool you hope you won't need. He lifted the latch and pulled the left door open, and the morning light cut into the barn in a wide golden stripe. And what he saw in that stripe stopped him where he stood. There was a woman on the barn floor. She was sitting against a hay bale with her back to the wall and her legs drawn up, and she was Apache. That was the first thing he registered, the deerskin dress, the dark hair loose over her shoulders, the brown skin, the face shaped by a lineage that had been on this land 1,000 years before his people put fences on it. She was maybe 30, and she was thin in a way that went past lean into something harder, the bones of her wrists showing through skin that was cracked and weather-beaten. Her eyes were closed, but she wasn't sleeping. He could tell by the tension in her jaw and the way her arms were wrapped around the children, not loosely, but locked, the way you hold something when you're ready to fight for it, even in your sleep. 4 children. 3 of them were tucked against her body in a tangle of limbs and hair and exhaustion. The youngest was maybe 3, asleep against her chest, with one small fist curled in the fabric of her dress. The next was a girl around 6, pressed into her mother's side with her thumb near her mouth. The third was another girl, maybe 8, curled in a ball with her head on her mother's knee. And the fourth, the oldest, was a boy. He was maybe 10, and he was not asleep. He was sitting upright next to his mother, with his back against the hay bale and his eyes wide open, and he was looking directly at Wade, with an expression that was not fear and not defiance, but something older than both. Readiness. The readiness of a child who has been the last line of defense so many times that it has become his resting state. Wade stood in the doorway with the rifle at his side and the light behind him, and for a long moment nobody moved. The woman's eyes opened. She looked at him, and then at the rifle, and then at him again, and her arms tightened around the children. But she didn't run, and she didn't beg, and she didn't make a sound. She just looked at him with dark eyes that held a calculation he recognized. She was measuring whether to fight or die, and she'd already decided that dying was acceptable if the children survived. "I'm not going to hurt you," Wade said. He said it slowly because he didn't know if she spoke English, and because the words mattered and he needed them to land. The boy spoke. His voice was clear and steady, and it came out in English that was careful but correct. "She knows. She doesn't trust words. She trusts what people do." Wade looked at the boy. "You speak English?" "My father taught me." "Where's your father?" "Dead." The soldiers killed him at the canyon. They killed everyone. We ran." Wade felt something shift in his chest. Not surprise. The territory had been full of stories for months. Cavalry raids on Apache camps, families scattered, people driven into the mountains and the desert with nothing. He'd heard the stories the way people in small towns hear stories about distant suffering, with sympathy that costs nothing because it asks nothing. But this wasn't a story. This was a woman and 4 children on his barn floor who had run until they couldn't run anymore, and had ended up here because here was as far as the running took them. "How long have you been here?" Wade asked. 2 nights, the boy said. "We came in through the back when you were sleeping. My mother said your barn was warm and your animals were fed, which means you're not a cruel man. Cruel men don't feed their animals well." Wade almost smiled. Almost. "What's your name?" "Tarek." "And your mother?" "Najoni." "Tell your mother she can stay. Not just the barn, the cabin. There's food, water, a fire. Tell her nobody's going to hurt her or any of you. Not while I'm standing here." Tarek translated. Najoni listened without expression. Then she said something back in Apache that was short and flat, and Tarek looked at Wade and said, "She says men have said that before." "I know they have. That's why I'm not asking her to believe me. I'm asking her to come inside and eat, and she can decide about believing later." Tarek translated again. Najoni looked at Wade for a long time. She looked at the rifle at his side. She looked at the open barn door and the cabin beyond it, and the morning light coming through warm and golden. Then she looked at the 3-year-old asleep against her chest, and something in her face that had been held rigid softened by 1 degree, just 1, and she nodded. Wade set the rifle against the barn wall. He stepped back from the doorway to give them room. And Najoni rose with the 3-year-old in her arms, and the other children peeled off the hay bale and stood around her. And they walked out of the barn and into the morning light, blinking, thin, exhausted, alive. By the way, if this story is already getting under your skin, take a moment to subscribe and leave a comment telling us what corner of the world you're listening from. We read every single one. Now, let's continue. Wade Hensley was 48 years old, and he'd been alone on this ranch for 6 years. His wife, Clara, had died of a fever the same winter the creek froze solid. And the double loss, his wife and his water, had nearly broken him. He'd saved the ranch, but he couldn't save himself, not in the way that mattered, which was the part of him that knew how to sit in a room with another person and feel like the room was big enough for both of them. Clara had been that. She'd been the person who made the cabin feel like a place instead of a structure. Without her, it was just logs and stone, and a stove that heated air that nobody breathed but him. They hadn't had children. They'd wanted them. Clara had wanted them with a hunger that lived in her eyes every time she saw a child in town. But it never happened, and the doctor couldn't say why. And after 10 years of trying, they'd stopped talking about it. The way you stop talking about a wound that won't heal. Not because it's better, but because the talking makes it bleed. When Clara died, the children they never had became one more absence in a cabin already full of them. He brought them inside. He stoked the fire and heated water and cooked what he had. Eggs, salt pork, cornbread from yesterday, dried apples. He set it on the table and stepped back, and the children ate the way Sadie had eaten in the last script. No, the way children eat when food has been uncertain for too long, quickly, with their eyes up, watching for the moment it gets taken away. Nijoni didn't eat. She sat in the chair by the stove and held the 3-year-old and watched Wade with those dark, measuring eyes. Tarek sat next to her and ate slowly, one hand near his mother at all times, the translator, the protector, the 10-year-old who had been carrying a family on his back since the canyon. "The soldiers," Wade said to Tarek. "How far behind are they?" "We don't know. We've been moving for 17 days. My mother knows the land. She took us through the high passes where horses can't follow. But they'll come eventually. They always come." Wade looked at Nijoni. She looked back. She understood more English than she spoke. He could see it in the way her eyes tracked his words before Tarek translated them. "If they come here," Wade said, "they won't find you." Tarek translated. Nijoni's eyes narrowed, not with suspicion, with confusion. She said something in Apache that was longer this time, more words, a question with weight behind it. "She wants to know why," Tarek said. "She says white men don't hide Apache. White men turn them in. She wants to know what you want from us." Wade looked at the children eating at his table. He looked at the 3-year-old asleep in Nijoni's arms. He looked at Tarak with his steady eyes and his careful English, and his shoulders that were too square for a boy his age. "I want that table to have people at it," Wade said. "That's all." Tarak translated. Nijoni was quiet for a long time. Then she said one word in English, her voice low and rough from disuse. "Okay." The soldiers came on the 9th day, 3 of them, riding up the valley trail in a column, rifles across their saddles, blue coats dusty from the road. Wade saw them from the pasture, and his stomach went cold. He rode back to the cabin fast and told Tarak to take his mother and the children to the root cellar beneath the kitchen floor. It was small and dark, and it smelled like earth and potatoes, and it was not a fit place for a woman and 4 children who had already spent weeks hiding in dark places. But it was hidden, and hidden was alive, and alive was the only thing that mattered. The sergeant was a thick-necked man with eyes that moved across the property like hands searching pockets. He asked Wade if he'd seen any Apache in the area, women, children, runaways from the canyon. Wade leaned against the porch rail and said no. The sergeant asked if he minded them searching the barn. Wade said, "Help yourself." They searched and found nothing. The sergeant looked at the cabin door. "Mind if we look inside?" "I do mind," Wade said. "This is my home. You've searched my barn. There's nothing here." The sergeant looked at him for a long time. He was measuring something. Not whether Wade was lying, but whether the lie was worth the trouble of proving. He looked at the cabin again. He looked at the empty yard, the quiet windows, the single man standing on his porch with his arms crossed and his jaw set, and nothing in his posture that invited further questions. "We'll be back through in a week," the sergeant said. "If you see anything, you report it to the post at Willow Bend." "Understood." They rode out. Wade waited until they were specks on the southern trail. Then he opened the cellar door, and Nijoni climbed out holding Koda, with Tarak right behind her and the 2 girls after him. Nijoni looked at Wade. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. She reached out and put her hand flat against his chest, over his heart, and held it there for 3 seconds. Then she took the children to the back room, and Wade sat down at the table and put his head in his hands and breathed and understood that he had just chosen a side in a war he hadn't started, and he would choose it again every time they asked. The days that followed were a study in two people learning to exist in the same space when everything about their lives said they shouldn't. Wade gave Najoni and the children the back room of the cabin. He slept in the front room by the stove. He kept his movements predictable. Same time waking, same time eating, same time working, same time coming back. He understood without being told that a woman who had watched soldiers kill her husband and burn her camp needed a world that was regular, that didn't surprise, that moved in patterns she could memorize and trust. Najoni watched him for the first week the way the boy had watched him in the barn, constantly, silently, cataloging every movement and every word and every absence of threat. She didn't help in the cabin at first. She sat with the children and she nursed the 3-year-old, whose name, Tarak told him, was Koda, and she watched. Then, on the 8th day, she rose before Wade, and when he came to the stove, the fire was already burning, and water was already hot, and she was standing by the table, with a look on her face that wasn't gratitude, but something more deliberate. It was decision. She had decided to be here, not just to survive here, to be here. She started working the land. Not the way Wade worked it. She had her own methods, older methods, techniques that came from a people who had been growing things in this territory since before the fences and the deeds and the concept of owning dirt. She showed him where to plant beans to fix the soil. She showed him which wild herbs along the creek could heal a wound or break a fever. She showed him how to read the behavior of his own cattle in ways he'd never noticed, how the lead cow angled her body before a storm, how the herd's grazing pattern predicted where the grass would be richest in spring. She did all of this without speaking English. She showed him with her hands, with gestures, with demonstrations, and Tarak filled in the gaps when language was needed, standing between his mother and this rancher like a bridge between two worlds that had been at war for longer than either of them had been alive. The 6-year-old, whose name was Doli, was the first to warm to Wade. She followed him to the barn one morning and stood in the doorway watching him saddle Boone, and when the horse turned his head and nudged her shoulder, she laughed, a clear, bright sound that cut through the morning like something the ranch had been waiting to hear, and she reached up and touched the horse's nose and said something in Apache that made Tarak smile. "She says he has a kind face," Tarak said, "like you." Wade looked at the horse looked at the girl, and for a moment the world was simple in a way that it almost never is. The 8-year-old, Alia, was quieter. She stayed close to Najoni and spoke only in Apache and watched the ranch through the windows like someone memorizing exits. Wade recognized the behavior. He'd seen it in Najoni. He'd seen it in animals that had been trapped before. He didn't approach Alia. He let her come to him on her own time, which took 3 weeks. And when she did, it was because he was mending a fence, and she picked up a board and held it steady while he hammered without being asked. And when they were done, she looked at the fence and then at him, and gave a nod that was so much like her mother's nod that he felt something tighten in his throat. Tarak was the one who changed everything. Not by warming to Wade. The boy had been warm from the start in his careful, measured way, but by telling him the truth. It happened on a night 3 weeks in. The children were asleep, and Najoni was in the back room, and Tarak was sitting on the porch step looking at the stars, and Wade came out and sat next to him. "Can I ask you something?" Wade said. "Yes." "You're English. It's better than most kids I've heard in town. Your father taught you?" Tarak was quiet for a moment. "My father was half white," he said. "His mother was Apache. His father was a trapper from Missouri who lived with the band for 12 years. My father spoke both languages. He wanted me to speak both because he said the world was changing and the people who survived would be the ones who could walk in both worlds." "He sounds like a wise man." He was. The soldiers didn't care about that. The silence that followed was heavy with things that couldn't be fixed and shouldn't be forgotten. Then Tarak said, "My father knew your name." Wade went still. "What?" "Before he died, before the soldiers came. He used to trade furs at the post near Willow Bend. He talked about a rancher north of the valley who treated Apache traders fair, who didn't cheat on weight, who shared coffee. He said the rancher's name was Hensley." Tarak looked at Wade. "That's why my mother came to your barn. She didn't pick it because it was warm. She picked it because my father said if anything ever happened, find the Hensley Ranch. He said you were a man who saw people, not skin." Wade couldn't speak. He sat on the porch step and felt the weight of a dead man's trust settle on his shoulders, and it was heavier than anything he'd ever carried, and lighter than anything he'd ever been given. A man he'd shared coffee with at a trading post. A man whose face he couldn't place among the dozens he'd traded with over the years. That man had remembered his name. That man had told his wife. That man had sent his family to Wade's barn to survive. "I didn't know him well enough," Wade said, his voice rough. "You knew him well enough," Tarak said. "That's why we're here." Najoni started speaking English in the 2nd month. Not fluently, not easily, but in fragments that grew longer each week, assembled from words she'd been absorbing since they arrived, held back not by inability, but by caution. The first full sentence she said to Wade was on a cold morning when he'd come in from the barn with frost on his coat and blood on his hand from a wire cut. She took his hand without asking, turned it over, looked at the cut and said, "Sit, I fix." He sat. She cleaned the wound with water and crushed herbs and wrapped it in a strip of cloth, and her hands were steady and warm, and it was the first time she'd touched him, and the first time he'd been touched by anyone in 6 years, and he sat at the table and stared at his wrapped hand and felt something open inside him that he'd boarded up when Clara died. They didn't fall in love the way people in towns fall in love, with dances and courting and the slow performance of interest. They fell in love the way people on the land fall in love, through work and weather and the daily proof that someone is who they say they are. He loved her because she could read the sky better than he could. She loved him because he built a shelf for Dolly's collection of stones and feathers without being asked. He loved her because she taught his cattle to respond to sounds instead of whips. She loved him because he sat with Tarak on the porch every evening and listened to the boy talk about his father without once trying to replace him. They married in the spring, not in a church. Nijoni wouldn't set foot in one, and Wade didn't blame her. They married on the porch with the 4 children around them, and a ceremony that was half Apache and half whatever Wade remembered from his parents' faith. Tarak stood between them and translated the promises back and forth, and the promises were simple. I will stay. I will protect. I will honor where you come from. I will build where we're going. Doli threw wildflowers. Alia held Coda. And when it was done, Nijoni looked at Wade and said in English, clear and certain, "You are my family now." And Wade said, "I was your family the moment I opened that barn door. I just didn't know it yet." 3 years later, the ranch had doubled, not just in herd, in life. Nijoni's knowledge of the land had transformed the way Wade worked it. The garden grew things he'd never thought possible at this altitude. The creek had been redirected using techniques she'd learned from her grandmother to irrigate the lower pasture. Tarak was 13 and could run the ranch operations alongside Wade, and had started teaching English to Apache children from a camp 2 valleys over who came once a week. Doli had named every animal on the property and could ride Boone better than Wade could, which the horse seemed to prefer. Alia had become the ranch's healer, mixing poultices from plants she and Nijoni gathered from the hills. And Coda was 6 and spoke 3 languages, Apache, English, and the private language of a child who has been loved so completely that he invents words for kinds of happiness that don't exist yet. One evening, Wade found Tarak on the porch, sitting in the same spot where he'd told Wade about his father. The boy was taller now, broader, with his mother's steady eyes and his father's gift for standing between worlds. "Do you remember what you told me?" Wade said, "that night, about your father knowing my name?" "I remember. I think about it every day, that a man I barely knew trusted me enough to send his family to my barn." Tarak looked at the ranch, the garden, the pastures, the cabin with light in every window and smoke from the chimney, and the sound of Doli laughing inside, and Coda shouting something in 3 languages at once. "He didn't just trust you," Tarak said. "He saw you, the way you see people, not what they look like, what they are. That's what he told my mother. He said the rancher at Willow Bend sees people." Tarak paused. He was right. Wade looked at the cabin. He looked at the life inside it. He looked at the light and the noise and the beautiful chaos of a family he'd never expected and didn't deserve, and had been given anyway, by a dead man's faith and a woman's courage, and 4 children who'd walked out of a barn and into his heart and never left. "Your father gave me everything," Wade said. "No," Tarak said. "You gave us everything. My father just knew you would." If this story stayed with you, if it reminded you that family crosses every border, that trust can survive even the worst the world does, and that sometimes the people meant for us arrive in ways we never expected, then this is where you belong. Subscribe for more stories of courage, quiet love, and the ties that hold us together when everything else falls apart. Subscribe now and don't miss the next one.